So the mighty Baneblade has finally got itself some decent armour and some cheaper guns. So let's talk about one build in particular that can laugh off high AP anti-tank fire like almost nothing else in 40k. Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, where today I thought we'd revisit the Baneblade, an iconic guard super heavy that's kind of been gathering dust on the shelf for a lot of players, for at least the majority of 9th edition and for a fair bit before. First up we'll take a look over its datasheet, a small comparison of the different turrets, whether or not to field sponsons, some of the best buffs and synergies on this mighty super heavy Lord of War, compare it to some Lehman Russes, and talk about how to field the tank in game. I must admit these Baneblade changes do seem to have inspired me to run quite a lot of numbers. First up, let's start with the generic Baneblade datasheet. It's basically been subpar to standard Lehman Russes and more so tank commanders for absolutely ages, basically flat worse in terms of both damage and defense, also having the 9th edition disadvantages of being a Titanic model interacting with terrain, and basically one of the only main reasons to field it was that it couldn't get locked down in combat due to being Titanic. Now though, Games Workshop really does seem to have given it a lot of boosts. It finally got the 2+ armour save to catch up with the Lehman Russes. Armour of Contempt made guard vehicles stronger in general, usually giving it a +1 to save against high AP. The Sponsons dropped down to 60 points per pair rather than a massive 100 points, and super heavy auxiliary detachments are now also command point free, one other small cost saving bonus. For the unit itself, it is quite a mighty beast. It's a Lord of War for the guard and costs 410 points, though a bunch of the other variants cost slightly more or less. For that you get a toughness 8 tank, 26 wounds at a save 2+ now. It moves 10 inches, only hits on 4s and degrades, which certainly is a weakness, but in combat it does actually hit with a surprising amount of attacks, 9 attacks hitting on 5s with a fairly powerful strength 9 AP2 damage D3. They're quite nice with the crush them stratagem, which we'll get onto in a second. Basically each of the different Baneblades comes packing a different powerful turret mounted gun, and the Baneblades and the Hellhammer themselves also pair that with a demolisher cannon. The Baneblade's main cannon itself gets you 3d6 shots at strength 9 AP3 and damage 3. A pretty decent all-round general purpose weapon, though hitting on 4s is a bit sad. Otherwise it's got a autocannon, a set of twin heavy bolters on the hull, plus those sponsons. It gets a hunter-killer missile and heavy stubber included for free now, and when you buy in sponsons you basically have to pay for the las cannons. It's 2 las cannons per set of sponsons, and for the sponsons in general that also includes 2 sets of twin heavy bolters or heavy flamers as well. Typically I'd be more tempted to take the heavy bolters over the heavy flamers. I think having more range is pretty useful. Otherwise, if it blows up in style with d6 mortal wounds, and it's got a steel behemoth rule, which means that if you fall back you can also charge, and it is quite possible to ping a Baneblade in and out in combat if there's some light enemy troops nearby that it can run over and then fall back and shoot. Overall, when you account for all the points, it still doesn't hit amazingly hard for the unit cost, but it can be really quite durable now, particularly when layered with a couple of save buffs that you can get for it, its tank ace trait and an Astra path. In general though, for a great big tank it is at least fairly flexible, moves fast with full firepower, and unlike Russes it doesn't get locked up when the enemy tags it in combat. Talking of tank aces though, these are the upgrades from that Greater Good Psychic Awakening book. You can typically choose 2 for your army, each costing 1 CP, and I think it is pretty tempting to put one on a super heavy if you are taking them along. You are giving up other choices like -1 damage on your tank commanders, or full payload on your manticores or basilisks though, so there is some trade-off. The ones available to the super heavies are Inspiring Might, Steadfast Leviathan, and Hold Down Deployment. Inspiring Might gives you a bonus to nearby infantry leadership, which isn't that great. Steadfast Leviathan allows you to get a regimental doctrine even in the super heavy auxiliary, so you could pick up the Castan Arcadian one, both of which are okay. Regardless of whether you pick this, you'll still have their keyword for stratagems and things though, so it is just things like the Cadian reroll ones to hit if stationary that you'd be getting. Really though, the very intriguing one I think is Hold Down Deployment, which basically states that this model receives the benefit of cover until the first time it moves. It's pretty massive, as Titanic vehicles usually don't get any sort of benefit from cover, and it means if you just have one of its far-flung corners just nosing into a light cover piece of terrain in your deployment zone, then you've effectively got a 2+ save Baneblade with Armour of Contempt that's also going to be getting an extra +1 to the save from that. It means you'd be saving AP-2 missile launchers on your 2+, and AP3 las cannons on a 3+, really quite massively durable there. Obviously it's not all game long if you do go moving about, but it certainly helps you survive the alpha strike. I guess the idea would be that deploy this in somewhere that's going to be fairly threatening, your opponent's going to want to deal with it first, and hopefully it's got good lines of sight that can just erase enemy infantry as a bit of a backfield bunker, blazing away with an awful lot of fun heavy weapons. Just for a durability comparison, if you had this trait prior to the upgrades, a standard Baneblade would take you something like 16 las cannon hits or 12 dark lance hits to bring down. Now, after Armour of Contempt and the 2+ armour save, it now takes over double the amount, 33 las cannons or 30 dark lance hits. Obviously it does need to be very survivable, and it's not going to be as tough in combat, but it's gone from a tank that was kind of a liability for losing at turn 1 into something that your opponent's almost certainly going to want to try and fire at something else, because it's just too tough. Of course, the Baneblade isn't the only variant that you can get. We've got 8 different variants within the Codex, plus the Stormblade from Forge World. The Baneblade has a general purpose cannon with the Demolisher. The Banehammer's got slightly bad damage, but slows enemy movement, though it does have a transport capacity and a firing deck, so you could put some heavy weapon teams in it or something. The Bane Sword has the Quake Cannon, which has a minimum damage of 3 and a big strength 14 on the shots. The Doom Hammer has a Magma Cannon. You get high AP and you get 2d6 pick the highest on the damage, again that transports 25 infantry and 10 gunfire. The Hellhammer's the most expensive at 450. It does have a very good gun though, at strength 10, AP minus 4, damage 3, ignoring cover, and also packs a Demolisher cannon to back it up as well. Then there's the Shadow Sword, which gets 3d3 shots at strength 16, AP 5, and a huge damage 2d6. Plus, if you happen to be firing at Titanic targets, you get +1 to hit, and you get to re-roll the wound roll as well, though typically you're normally going to be wounding on 2s. Then we've got the Stormlord. That one's got the massive transport capacity with 40 models and 20 of them can fire. The Vega Bolter is a bit more tailored to infantry though, 20 shots at strength 6, AP 2, damage 2. And finally the Storm Sword is 400 points. That one's got a siege cannon that's 2d6 shots at strength 10, AP 4, damage d6, ignores cover and rerolls damage results of 1. Overall, really quite a lot of massive guns with minor variations and advantages. Here's just a very rough breakdown of some of these strongest hitting weapons against different targets. Standard Space Marines with 2 wounds and Armour of Contempt, Custodies with their Toughness 5, 2+ save and 3 wounds, and say a typical Toughness 7 vehicle. The numbers typically tend to be at least fairly similar for Toughness 8 targets as well. I would say that probably the standard Baneblade does come out as one of the best options here. It's one of the strongest both with Marines, Custodies and vehicles, though the shine might be taken off those numbers just a little bit if you wait for points. It does cost a touch more than the cheaper variants, but overall I think that the small points increase does work out to be worth the trade-off. The Hellhammer costs 40 points more, but does beat out the Baneblade in all the different categories. I feel like the two are fairly similar for the points cost. I'd say maybe the Baneblade's just a tiny bit more efficient of the two, though AP4 and ignores cover can be very nice in a world of Armour of Contempt. Otherwise, for slightly more standout choices, the Stormlord is unsurprisingly not too bad against 2-wound infantry. It does fairly well against the Custodies as well, but not as well as the Baneblade or the Hellhammer, and it is one of the pricier variants. Against vehicles, most of them tend to do at least fairly well, besides maybe the Banehammer and the Stormlord. The Baneblade, Hellhammer, and the cheaper Banesword all do quite well there. I'd say the Banesword in particular is quite impressive, given that it's only 370 points, so you do get quite a decent point saving there. But of course the standout is the Shadow Sword. You do around about 18 wounds just with the main gun to a Toughness 7 vehicle, often going to be killing it. And of course if your opponent does bring super heavies, then it gets a massive leg up. It actually deals more wounds to a Toughness 8 Knight than a Toughness 7 vehicle, despite the Knight having an invulnerable save. In theory, you average 18 wounds to a Knight, though obviously this is really quite swingy depending on how many shots you get through and what you roll on those big 2d6 rolls. Overall, for general purpose raw damage, I'd be quite tempted by the Baneblade, and the Shadow Sword is obviously excellent if you are wanting to target some tanks. Another question I was kind of wondering was whether or not Sponsons seemed like a good idea. Just to weigh up how much they add compared with a standard Baneblade, I've just done the damage output for a standard Baneblade, including their heavy bolters and auto cannons, and then just seeing how much a 60-point set of Sponsons would add to the equation. Against the Space Marines it works out to be really quite a lot, as heavy bolters are pretty efficient against 2-wound infantry, even with Armour of Contempt. A set of Sponsons kills on average almost 2 more Marines, almost 1 more Custody, or around 4 more wounds to a Toughness 7 vehicle. In general, the percentage increases tend to be better against the infantry than the tanks, mainly weighted by all those heavy bolter shots, though by making the platform more expensive by putting Sponsons on it, you don't add any more durability, so it does basically increase the enemy's firepower efficiency as well against the vehicle. Going from 410 points to 470 points is basically a 15% increase, so your opponent's going to be killing 15% more worth of value for that. In general, I do feel like the number trade-off does look like it's worth it though. Gaining something like 30 to 40% extra firepower for the cut of 15% of durability, generally seems like you're coming out ahead. I guess it depends whether you're valuing durability or the damage more for the tank. Titanic vehicles are going to be very hard to hide in your deployment zone, so they might get exposed right away. Overall though, maybe depending on your list a bit, it does seem like Sponsons seem worth it, and it could add even more value to any buffs that you can put on the tank. Speaking of which, let's talk about Baneblade buffs and synergies. We already talked about the tank cases and how I really quite like that hold down deployment thing, but you can back that off with some other things. Just for stratagems, I think that Crush Them is really worth it on a Baneblade. 1 command point to have your tank hitting on 2s in combat, and that's 9 attacks at strength 9, AP minus 2, damage D3, all hitting on 2s, and they should happily chew through something like 2 or 3 elite infantry or a bunch of light ones. Doesn't seem at all bad to me if your opponent thought that the only thing that they had to worry about was the firepower. Even a very bracketed Baneblade could suddenly turn into a big combat monster if your opponent's not expecting it. Otherwise, you could access defensive gunners for 1 command point plus the Overwatch CP. A little bit on the pricey side, but generally with these huge tanks you've got an enormous amount of firepower coming in. And I think 1 command point for jury rigging is usually worth mentioning on guard vehicles, just because if it puts you up a bracket for the shooting phase, then it could be well worth it both in terms of damage and the small amount of extra defense that you regain. I think if I were taking a Baneblade along, I'd almost certainly back it up with an Astropath. It's the other really good way that you can stack extra saves on the same vehicle. Psychic Barrier is a fairly easy cast on a 35-point model, and that's another way that you can have AP-3 fire being tanked on a 3+ armor save. Theoretically, if you manage to combine that with the hold down deployment trait, then that would give you an effective 0+ armor save with Armour of Contempt, and kind of hilariously be tanking any AP-3 shooting on a 2+ save. Obviously you do need to have not moved for that, and you won't be getting it first turn if your opponent goes first, but still that is really quite massive. It does make the Baneblade theoretically one of the most durable units in the whole codex with that combo. Otherwise, an Astropath with Night Shroud again is another durability boost, that's -1 to hit at range. If you really wanted to go absolutely all in on making this thing unkillable, then for another 35 points you could consider it. Otherwise, character-wise, most things don't have all that much impact on super heavies. Yarrick could give you reroll hit rolls of 1, which isn't usually terrible on a great big tank like this. He does cost 110 points though. I think it's going to be borderline worth it unless you're using those rerolls on something else as well. And you could bring along a cheap Tech Priest Engineer to pile some more wounds onto it. Again, could add into the whole durability combo if you're wanting to spend yet more. Finally, a bunch of the regiments can be handy. Typically you're not going to be getting any regimental traits unless you're using the tank ace to do so. Fielding a full super heavy detachment of this costs 6 CP these days, which is usually pretty much never wanting to happen in Nephilim. For Cadians though, overlapping fields of fire is one way that you can have a Baneblade hitting on 3s. Use something to plink a wound, then 2 CP to get all that firepower on a much better ballistic skill. And they also have a very cheap stratagem called Load Fire Reload, usually very good for standard Lehman Russes, for exploding 6s to hit on blast weapons, or getting double exploding 6s to hit if you happen to be targeting tanks, and on something like the Baneblade's main cannon or Demolisher cannon, or even the Shadow Sword's Volcano cannon when you're targeting a Titanic vehicle. That's usually going to quite easily add enough damage to be worth it on such a big gun. Otherwise, for Kathachans, you could think about hovering next to Sergeant Harker. I think his damage buff is almost worth it just in itself as it's so cheap, plus he blazes away with his Heavy Bolter too, which doesn't hurt. And Vostroyans I think are worth a shout as well. 1 command point to have their tank hit on 3+ with their Firstborn Pride. That's a cheap and easy way for a more dangerous Baneblade. For sake of comparison within the codex, I thought it might be interesting to compare the numbers between a Baneblade and Tank Commander Russes. Maybe a typical popular build with a Demolisher cannon and a Las cannon. I must admit, just on raw numbers, the Russ does do very well still, though it does have some other advantages and disadvantages. First up, if we compared it to a 4-Sponson Baneblade, which I think is maybe the way to go seeing as the Sponsons seem pretty efficient, the durability of the standard Russes still comes out slightly ahead. Per 100 points of models, the standard Russ is around 17% tougher, just for having the same amount of Toughness 8 2+ save wounds. Obviously, if you have the Baneblade without the Sponsons, the Baneblade does become a little bit tougher than the Russ, but it does mean that you've got a far less ranged threat. If you do take the hold down deployment trait though, then say versus a typical AP-3 anti-tank gun like a Las cannon, then your Baneblades do win the durability war. It'll take an extra 26% enemy firepower to gun down the equivalent wounds of Baneblades compared with Tank Commander Russ. Then I thought it could be interesting to look at the damage per 100 points against a swathe of different targets. For this I am assuming that the Demolisher cannons are in range, and the Tank Commanders are using the reroll 1s to hit order. though I haven't assumed any other regimental traits like Cadian, which might put the Demolishers further ahead. Even without, though, it's a pretty convincing clean sweep for the Demolisher. They're only slightly ahead against infantry like Guardsmen or Space Marines, where the Baneblades, heavy bolters and things do come in handy, but against elite infantry like Custodies or vehicles like a Toughness 7 vehicle, the Demolisher tank commanders remain being excellent. It's an extra plus 50% damage against the Custodies and almost double damage versus the vehicles for the cost. Overall, I think it does still stack up to the standard Russes being stronger than the Baneblade, though obviously the Baneblade is competing far better than it ever did before. It's not to say that it doesn't have some other advantages though. Of course the Baneblade can't be locked into combat. If you get something fast just tying up this Russ, then its firepower is basically ruined for a turn. And if the Baneblade happens to be close, it's actually a good thing, as you could get some very good melee on the go with Crush then. I'd say the other main advantage of the Baneblade is that it's just one single massive unit, so the buffs that you can put on it are really good, like that tank ace trait for cover, and it makes some of the most efficient uses of things like the Astropath psychic buffs, or any stratagems that you can use on it. Plus the Demolisher cannons on the Lehman Russes are very short ranged as well, where much more of the Baneblade's guns are longer ranged. You don't have to worry about getting quite as close as you do with the Russes. Otherwise though, the Baneblade does have some downsides. No tank orders to swap to other things if the reroll ones isn't the optimal choice. The tank commanders get their regimental traits, which can help out too. The tank commanders could have their own tank ace traits on the go, such as -1 damage, and they've generally got better stratagem support throughout the codex. Basically, overall, for just raw might, you can't really beat the Demolisher tank commanders. The Baneblade's main advantages, though, is that it can get ridiculously tough with hold-down deployment, and it's almost certainly worth buying an Astropath for the +1 saves, and if the enemy happens to come and charge it, then you won't be able to lock it up, unlike the Russes. So overall, I think I probably would still rate Demolisher Tank Commander Russes as being the stronger unit, but maybe not by quite as much. I think if I was going to try and make a Baneblade work, I'd probably just take the one, use that hold down deployment trait, and then back it up with an Astropath with Psychic Barrier. I think that several of the variants would work. The standard Baneblade seems absolutely fine, though the Shadow Sword does seem incredibly scary just for that ridiculously powerful gun to take out enemy heavies. A lot of stronger guard lists seem to be using Cadian at the moment, and that could come in handy for the Baneblade as well, for that overlapping fields or exploding sixes to hit with blast weapons, so it could be a very efficient target for amping up the damage like that. I think I'd want to set it up actually fairly close to the front in the deployment zone, so hopefully it gets good line of sight and doesn't have to move at all, and then just stay put, casting Psychic Barrier on the thing until it either makes more sense for it to move, or the opponent gets close and maybe you could do an opportunistic crush them charge and double down on damage between your actual ranged guns and those adamantium tracks. I think maybe even if the Baneblade doesn't wind up being the absolutely most optimal thing in the world, it still seems like it could be a massively annoying unit for many armies. A big massive tank sitting fairly prominently in your deployment zone, saving AP -3 things on a 2+, and hopefully at least dealing some pretty major damage to one unit every turn. It definitely has its weaknesses, such as being vulnerable to -1 to hit rules, debuffs that target big units, and not being able to hide behind obscuring terrain turn 1, but certainly if you wanted to field a Baneblade, then it's better to do so now than it's ever been at any other point in 9th edition. So anyway, look forward to hearing your thoughts on the tank. Do you feel that Baneblades could actually be worth using now, or are you going to be sticking with the Russes? Let me know your thoughts, and if I missed anything down in the comments below, always happy to hear your feedback. If you enjoyed the video, feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics, where I'll certainly keep the regular 40k videos coming. I do tend to post new ones just about every day, and I'm sure there'll be plenty more for the Guard in the run-up to their new 9th edition codex. Finally, if you have enjoyed the video, I would just like to mention that Auspex Tactics does have a Patreon page, and you can find it down in the video description. Making all the YouTube videos does take a fair amount of time and effort, and if you are enjoying a lot, then any support is enormously appreciated. Channel patrons do get a fair few advantages, seeing certain videos early, regular votes to see what sort of things happen next on the channel, and automatic entry into the regular prize giveaways with the chance to win some big model kits each month. If any of that sounds good to you, or you'd just like to help support, the link is down in the video description. In any case, a massive thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.